There is a psalm almost everyone in the Western world has heard. 6 short verses. Most people can recite the opening line by heart. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The words slip out the way familiar things do. Easy, smooth, almost weightless. It is the psalm we read at funerals, the one whispered at hospital beds, the one printed on sympathy cards and cross-stitched onto nursery walls. We have absorbed it as the comfort psalm, a pastoral hush, a soft hand laid on the shoulder of someone who is afraid. And that reading is not wrong. The comfort is really there. Generations of grieving people have leaned on these 6 verses and not been let down. But what almost no modern reader hears is that the comfort is the smallest thing in the psalm. Strip away the embroidery and the soft pastel paintings. Strip away the funeral programs. Read it again with fresh eyes, and Psalm 23 is something stranger. It was written by a king, not a poet retreating into nature, a head of state, in the language of empire with the weight of a throne behind every word. And under every line, there is a quiet detonation that the original audience would have heard immediately, and that we walk straight past. 3,000 years of distance have softened the explosion into a lullaby. We are going to put the dangerous psalm back under the gentle one, because almost everything that makes Psalm 23 strange is hidden in 2 facts about the ancient world, and 1 move inside the poem itself that nobody is taught to watch for. Once you see those 3 things, you cannot unsee them. Every line gets bigger. The first thing is what kind of person a shepherd actually was in David's world. The picture in our heads is wrong by about 10 social classes. The second thing is what kind of person normally used shepherd imagery. The metaphor did not belong to peasants, it belonged to kings. And the third thing is happening inside the psalm itself, a quiet shift twice in the way David speaks. Once you can see it, the poem opens up 3 keys: the view from the bottom, the view from the top, and the seam down the middle of the poem where it changes shape. We will turn each of them slowly in the next chapters. They are the difference between Psalm 23 as a lullaby and Psalm 23 as a manifesto, because the man who wrote it was at that moment the king of Israel, and what he is about to do with the word shepherd is not what kings do. Try to forget for a moment what this psalm sounds like at a graveside. Hear it the way the first audience heard it, Hebrew, around a fire in the ancient world's vocabulary of power. To them, every word in the opening line was loaded. Lord, shepherd, I. The very lineup of those 3 words was already saying something the king of Israel should not be saying. By the end of 6 verses, David will have done something most kings in history never dared. He will have refused his own throne in favor of a real one. And along the way, he will tuck inside the poem one of the most precise short pictures of God's care ever written. Under a metaphor most of his neighbors used to flatter themselves. The comfort survives, it is still there, but it sits on top of a poem far braver and far stranger than the funeral version. This is Psalm 23, the way it was first heard, the way it was first meant, the way most modern readers have never been taught to hear it at all. To understand what David did in Psalm 23, you have to start where he started, and where he started was beneath notice. When the prophet Samuel arrived in Bethlehem to anoint a new king out of Jesse's sons, Jesse paraded 7 boys in front of him. He did not bother to bring in the youngest. The boy was out with the sheep, and you did not interrupt important business for a shepherd. 7 sons in the room. Each one passed over. Then Samuel asked the question Jesse had not thought to answer. Are these all the boys you have? There is yet the youngest, Jesse admitted, but he is keeping the sheep. The boy was not in the room. He was not even on the list. That is the social weight of the word shepherd in David's world. Not picturesque, not pastoral, forgettable, beneath consideration. The prejudice was older than David. It stretched back centuries before him into the courts of Egypt itself. The book of Genesis records the rule plainly. Every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. It is the reason Joseph quietly settled his shepherd family in Goshen, off in the edge lands out of polite Egyptian sight, where the smell of the flock would not offend the palace. In Egyptian eyes, the shepherd was dirty work, constant contact with animals, constant contact with dung, constant contact with death. They were the lowest rung of the working world, wandering laborers without land, without a settled town, without a clean place at any respectable table. That is the inheritance the word shepherd is already carrying when David, generations later, picks it up and writes his most famous poem. By the time of the rabbis, the prejudice had hardened into law. There were lists of trades whose testimony was no longer accepted in court. The shepherd was on those lists, so were tax collectors, so were dice players and dung gatherers. The respectable assumption was that a shepherd was probably a thief. He was assumed to be grazing his flock on land that did not belong to him. He was assumed to be quietly skimming wool, meat, milk from his employer. He could not testify in court. His word did not count. If his neighbor robbed him, he could not even stand up to name it. Ritually, he was almost always unclean, around dead animals, around lambing, around the dung of the flock, unable to keep festivals and Sabbath like settled people. He was the migrant labor of the ancient world, necessary, tolerated, and kept at arm's length. Now put it all together. Hold every one of those associations in your hand at once. The shepherd in David's Hebrew is the dirty man, the untrustworthy man, the man whose testimony does not count and whose work belongs to someone else. And David, anointed king of Israel, the boy who ran the long way back from the field that day, Samuel asked, keeps the word. He does not trade the crook for the crown. He does not edit out the fields. He picks up the lowest word in the language and writes a poem with it. That alone would have surprised the first people who heard the psalm, but it is only half of why. The other half is what kings, every king from Egypt to Babylon, were already doing with this exact word, and it is the opposite of what David is about to do. While the boy David was watching sheep on a Bethlehem hillside, something very different was happening in the palaces of the ancient world. In those palaces, the word shepherd was not insult. It was the highest title a king could claim. Hammurabi of Babylon, the great lawgiver, opens his famous law code by introducing himself, not as ruler, not as warrior, as shepherd. He calls himself the shepherd of the oppressed and of the slaves. The man at the top of the world wraps himself in the language of the people at the bottom. It is not a one-time slogan. Across centuries of Babylonian and Assyrian kings, the same title repeats, shepherd of the people, shepherd of the lands. The metaphor was not new. It was older than Israel itself, and it belonged to the men with the most thrones, not the most sheep. Travel south to Egypt, and you find the same metaphor cast in gold and laid in tombs. The pharaohs were buried clutching two tools across their chests, a flail or firipro for threshing, and a crook, the shepherd's crook. The Egyptian word for it was heka. It is the same root as the word for ruler. The crook was the scepter. The shepherd's tool was the sign of the throne. On the walls of his tomb, the pharaoh is painted with his people drawn small around his feet, the flock he claimed to guide and to feed. Every pharaoh wore the crook. Every pharaoh said, with his body I am the shepherd. The whole land below me is my flock. And underneath the language, no one in the palace had ever actually slept in a field or pulled a lamb out of a thorn bush. They wore the title. They did not do the work. Israel was not exempt from this language. The same metaphor lived in her own kings and her own prophets. When the elders made David king at Hebron, the very words God gave him were these, "You shall shepherd my people, Israel." The pun was not lost on anyone listening. The boy who had been the literal shepherd was now the metaphorical shepherd. The crook had become the crown. And when later the Israelite kings turned out to be terrible kings, the prophets reached for the same metaphor and turned it against them. Ezekiel called them shepherds who feed themselves and not the flock. Jeremiah called them shepherds who scattered the sheep. Because in Israel, as in every other empire, the title shepherd could be claimed without ever once doing what shepherds actually did. So now the word shepherd has a double life. On the ground it means dirty, untrustworthy, despised. In the palace it means sovereign, ruler, owner of lands, the one who decides who eats and who does not. The pun was always there. Every Hebrew listener heard both meanings at once whenever a king spoke the word. To call yourself a shepherd in David's world was to do something deliberate. You were claiming a throne with one hand and a clay-stained staff with the other. Now look at David, king of Israel, anointed, throned, about to open the most famous psalm in the world. Every audience that hears him is waiting to find out which kind of shepherd he is about to claim to be. the kingly one, the royal one, the shepherd of the people. Watch what he does instead. The opening line is 6 words in Hebrew, 6 words, and every one of them is loaded. The Lord is my shepherd. We hear it as a comfort. To David's audience, it lands as a claim, because in every kingdom around Israel, that first noun belonged to someone else. The shepherd of Egypt was Pharaoh. The shepherd of Babylon was the king. David takes the title out of every one of those palaces and hands it upward. The Lord, he says, not Pharaoh, not Caesar's grandfather, not me. The Lord, Yahweh, is the only shepherd in this poem. Every other claimant is quietly excused from the conversation. In one short noun, David has stripped the title off every empire in the ancient world, and he has not even reached the verb yet. Now the verb, the Lord is my shepherd. Read that sentence backward. If the Lord is the shepherd, then the speaker is the sheep, and that is the move no one in the palace world expected. In any other ancient throne room, this is the line a king uses to call his subjects sheep. David flips it. The king becomes the sheep. The crown looks upward at a higher shepherd. He empties the royal title out of himself and hands it upward. In a culture where kings inflated themselves into shepherds, David shrinks himself to make room for a real one. It is not modesty as decoration. It is honest geometry. The king who would have been the shepherd in any other empire steps down into the flock. For everyone listening in the ancient world, this alone was a sentence that should not have been possible, and he is only on the 3rd word. Then the next phrase, I shall not want. We hear it as quiet contentment. The Hebrew is sharper than that. The verb is chaser, to lack, to be in need, to be missing something essential. It is the language of a person about to starve, not a person sipping water under a tree. In David's world, you did not survive lack by being patient. You survived it by attaching yourself to a patron, a wealthier man who promised provision in return for your loyalty. The whole society was a web of dependency, peasant to landlord, landlord to noble, noble to king, every cup filled because a higher cup permitted it. And into that web, David drops one short line, I shall not want, translated honestly, I have no need of any of you. It is not contentment, it is a quiet declaration of independence. The line dismisses every smaller shepherd in the room. Put the 2 halves of the line together now. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The first half hands the title to God. The second half excuses David from every human patron. 2 short halves, one coordinated move. The opening verse of Psalm 23 dismantles the entire economy of dependence that ran the ancient world. It does it in 6 words. The king who should be the patron has named his own patron. Everyone else can stop bowing to lesser shepherds. That is verse 1. A king's quiet act of treason against every throne, including his own. And he has not even begun to describe what the shepherd actually does. That is where the poem turns next, to the fields, the water, and the night. Verse 2 opens in a green pasture. We hear those words and picture a postcard. People who have actually kept sheep hear something else, because sheep do not lie down easily. They are nervous creatures. There are 4 separate reasons a flock will refuse to settle, and any one of them keeps every animal standing all night. They will not lie down if they are hungry. The grass underfoot has to be good, not just present, but worth the effort of eating. They will not lie down if they are thirsty. A flock without water is a flock that will not rest, no matter how soft the ground. They will not lie down if they are tormented by flies and ticks and the small pests of the field. Constant irritation keeps the whole flock pacing, and they will not lie down if they are afraid. A single dark shape on a far ridge keeps every animal in the flock standing in alarm. 4 fears, 4 separate refusals. Any one of them is enough to keep a flock awake all night. Now read the verse again. He makes me lie down in green pastures. The verb is causative. He causes me to lie down. He does not simply walk the flock to a pretty field and hope. He works ahead of them so that by the time they arrive, lying down is the only thing left for them to do. He scouts the pasture days before. He clears the worst of the burrs and thorns. He walks the perimeter looking for tracks of jackals and wolves. He treats the sheep ahead of time. Oil on raw noses, simple remedies in the wool, so the flies will not torment them when they finally arrive. By the time the flock comes over the rise, every threat has been answered before they could ask. The lying down is the evidence of the shepherd's competence, not a pretty picture. Then the line continues. He leads me beside the still waters. The phrase is doing the same kind of work as the green pasture, careful, exact, and easy to miss, because sheep are very particular drinkers. They will not approach moving water. Their wool is thick, easily waterlogged, and a sheep that falls into a swift stream drowns quickly. A nervous sheep at the edge of a fast stream will simply refuse to drink. It will stand by the water and die of thirst rather than risk it. So the shepherd does the small, invisible work of fixing that. He finds a quiet pool, or if no still water exists, he builds one. He drops stones across the rush of the current, dams a small section, lets the surface settle. He makes still water where the stream did not give him any, and only then does he lead the flock. By the time the sheep reach the bank, the water is safe, calm, drinkable. The fear has been taken out of it before they arrived. This is the part of shepherding the sheep cannot see. The pasture is checked while they are still in the fold. The stream is dammed while they are walking the trail behind. By the time they arrive, the day is already arranged. The pasture is good. The water is still. The flock can simply lie down. That is not soft poetry. It is a careful inventory of what it costs to keep a flock alive, the four fears handled, the still water made. And David is saying, this is the kind of shepherd the Lord is. Not a king who claims the title and stays in the palace. A worker who has already walked the field. The first half of verse 3 follows naturally. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness. But hidden inside the gentle phrase, he restoreth my soul, is one of the strangest pieces of shepherding language in the whole psalm. And to hear it, we have to meet a cast sheep. He restoreth my soul. It is the line everyone remembers. It is also the line most modern English readers most misunderstand. In English, the word soul has drifted upward. We hear it as the airy, weightless part of us, the part that thinks and dreams and rises out of the body. The Hebrew is not that gentle. The word David wrote is nephesh, and nephesh is not soul in the airy sense. It is the whole living self. It is the breath itself. Nephesh is your throat, your appetite, your hunger, your life force. When the Hebrew Bible says nephesh, it means everything that makes you alive. So when David writes, he restoreth my nephesh, he is not saying I felt cheered up. He is saying I was almost gone and he brought me back. The verb restoreth is the Hebrew word shuv, to turn back, to bring back from the brink. The same word used elsewhere for return, for repentance, for being lifted out of exile. And shepherds in David's world had a very specific picture for this verb. They used it about something that happened on the pasture more often than anyone would like. They called it being cast, a sheep that has lain down to rest, rolled slightly off balance, and ended up on its back. A cast sheep cannot get up. The thick wool, the heavy belly, the short legs, none of them give it leverage. It can struggle and bleat, but it cannot right itself. Within hours, gas builds in its stomach. Blood flow to the legs is cut off. On a hot day, a cast sheep can die in less than half a day without a single predator touching it. And before any predator arrives, the vultures see it. They circle. They wait. From the air, a cast sheep is visible from a very long distance. This is what nephesh in trouble actually looks like. Not a dramatic battle, not a moment of doubt, a small living thing turned upside down with no power of its own to right itself. And then the shepherd comes, he sees the missing sheep from the count, or he hears the bleating, or he reads the circling birds, and he walks straight to it. He kneels in the dust beside it, he turns it back over, he works circulation back into the legs with his hands. He does the patient, embarrassing work of putting the animal back on its feet. And then he holds it up. He stands beside it, an arm around its body, supporting it until the legs steady and the blood flows and the animal can stand on its own. That is the picture inside the verse. He restoreth my nephesh. He turns me back. He puts me on my feet again. He does not let me die there in the dust. It is not the gentle line we have been quoting. It is a rescue line. The shepherd of this psalm does not refresh David. He keeps David alive. And once the verse is read that way, the next line stops sounding like decoration. It sounds like part of the same rescue. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness. To modern ears, the line lands like a moral suggestion. The shepherding world hears something more practical. In the rocky terrain of Judah, paths were not equal. One trail led to fresh grazing. Another led to a cliff edge or ravine where the flock could be ambushed. The right path is the path that sustains life. The wrong path ends it, and sheep have no way of telling them apart. That is what the shepherd's knowing is for. He knows which trails sustain the flock. He keeps them on those trails not to be strict, but because he can see what they cannot. So the whole verse holds together. He restoreth my soul means he keeps me alive. Paths of righteousness means trails that lead to life. But the path is about to change. The next verse leads down into a place no flock walks willingly. And it is there that something hidden in the Hebrew will quietly shift the entire poem. For 3 verses, David has been speaking about the shepherd. He makes me lie down, he leads me, he restores me. Third person, polite at a distance. In verse 4, with no warning, that changes. David stops talking about the shepherd. He starts talking to the shepherd. Thou art with me. The distance has closed. The shepherd is no longer being described. He is being addressed directly face to face. And notice when the shift happens. Not in the green pasture, not by the still water. It happens at the moment the trail leads down into the dark. The shepherd does not speak from across the pasture. In this verse, he walks alongside. The pronoun is doing what the geography is doing. That is the verse hidden inside the verse. The distance closes precisely when the danger rises. The shepherd gets closer when the trail gets darker, the valley of the shadow of death. The phrase has become so familiar we forget it points to actual geography. The Hebrew word is tselmoeth, deep darkness, and shepherds in David's world knew exactly which valleys it pointed to. The narrow ravines of the Judean hill country, where cliffs cut off the sun by midday, where the soil was too thin to grow grass, where the heat held all day, where wolves and jackals and big cats waited just inside the dark. These were real places, not abstract dread, not a metaphor for grief. The flock had to walk through them to reach the better grazing further on. The only path to summer pasture went through. There was no route around. The flock did not get to skip the dark. And David, king of Israel, hunted in his youth by Saul, hunted later by his own son, knew the geography from the inside. He had slept in these valleys himself. Then the verse names the shepherd's tools. Thy rod and thy staff, 2 separate words in Hebrew, 2 separate tools. The first is the rod, the Hebrew is shebet, a short, heavy club, the shepherd's weapon, the thing he carried to defend the flock. He used it to drive off wolves, jackals, the big cats that prowled the ravine walls. It was not symbolic. It was the difference between a flock and a graveyard. At the end of the day, he used the same rod to count the flock. The sheep passed under his rod one at a time, and as each one passed, he looked it over for cuts and injuries. The same shepherd that fought the wolf in the morning examined the lambs in the evening. One tool, 2 uses, both of them protection. And David writes that this is one of the things that comforts him. The shepherd is armed, the shepherd is willing. The shepherd's weapon is not for show. The second tool is different. The Hebrew word is mishenet. The long curved staff, the crook, the shepherd's hand extended. He used it to guide, a gentle pressure on the side of a sheep. A nudge at the right moment to keep it on the path. He used it to rescue. When a sheep slipped between 2 rocks or fell into a crevice, the curved end hooked under its body and lifted it up, and he used it to steady. The long staff in his hand was a third leg on rough ground, a balance for the shepherd and a reach for the sheep. One tool to fight for the sheep, one tool to rescue and guide the sheep. The shepherd's comfort is the comfort of being defended and tenderly handled by the same hand. That is verse 4. The shepherd walks beside you in the dark, armed for your enemies, gentle in his own hands. And just when the valley feels heaviest, the next verse does something almost impossible. The poem leaves the field altogether. And then the metaphor does something we are not ready for. Without warning, in the middle of a poem about a shepherd, the speaker sits down to a feast. Sheep do not sit at tables. The picture has changed. The flock is gone. The pasture is gone. The speaker is no longer outdoors at all. The poem has stepped indoors. We are no longer in a flock under a shepherd. We are in a host's house, at his table, as his honored guest. And the host is the same one who walked beside us in the valley. The shepherd has stepped through a doorway and become the host. The sheep has stepped through with him and become the guest. This is not a different psalm starting. It is the same psalm escalating. The shepherd who kept us alive in the field is the host who seats us at his own table. That is the move the verse is making. Watch what it does with three things, and the table, the oil, and the cup. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. The first picture is the table itself and where the table sits. In the ancient world, hospitality was law. Once a guest crossed your threshold and sat at your table, he was under your protection. The table itself became a wall, and outside the table sat enemies, real ones, watching, hungry, unable to come any closer. They could see the feast, they could smell the bread, but the threshold was not theirs to cross. The host's hospitality had drawn a line they did not dare step over. To prepare a feast for someone in the presence of his enemies and not lift a hand to chase those enemies away was to declare them powerless at this threshold. The host does not need to raise a sword. The set table is the verdict. Inside this room, you are safe. Outside this room, they have no claim on you. Then the verse moves to the second picture. Thou anointest my head with oil. And in this single phrase, three different meanings collide at once. The first meaning belongs to the field. Shepherds anointed their sheep with oil. They poured it over the heads of the flock to keep flies out of the nostrils, to heal scrapes from the rocks, to soothe the rams whose horns had been split, clashing for dominance. The second meaning belongs to the banquet. A host welcomed his honored guest at the door by pouring scented oil over the head, a sign of dignity, of welcome, of being treated as someone of weight. And the third meaning belongs to the throne. To anoint a king, a prophet poured oil over the head. The same oil, the same gesture, but now an act of crowning. Three meanings, one verb. The sheep is being healed, the guest is being honored, the king is being crowned, all at the same time in the same single line. And David is letting all three sit on top of each other. The sheep he is, the guest he is, and the king he never stopped being. Then the third picture, my cup runneth over. We hear it as poetic excess. The host's table knew exactly what the gesture meant. At a host's table in the ancient East, a guest's cup was kept filled. When the host wanted to say, stay longer, he kept refilling it. When he wanted to say, it is time to leave, he stopped. And so the rule was simple. A full cup means stay. A cup left empty means the visit is finished. A cup the host keeps pouring past the rim, that means stay as long as you wish. You are honored here. The cup overflowing is not poetry. It is a signal. It is the host's body language saying, I have no intention of ever asking you to leave. Three pictures, the table, the oil, the cup. And David is on the receiving end of all three. The boy who began the psalm, lying in a field, is now seated at a king's table, being anointed for royalty. The shepherd has not just kept David alive, he has lifted him up. And the last verse will reveal what kind of journey this has actually been. The poem closes with one verse left. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. The English softens it. Follow me. We picture a quiet trailing, a small good thing walking gently behind us as we go about our days. That is not the Hebrew. The verb David wrote is radaf, and radaf is not a soft word anywhere else in the Bible. It is a hunter's word, a warrior's word. Radaf is the word for armies pursuing their enemies across a battlefield. For creditors hunting a debtor through the streets. For a hunter chasing prey, it intends to bring down. It is not a quiet word. It is never used softly. It always means something is closing the gap behind someone who does not want it there. And in this last verse, David takes that warrior's word and turns it the other direction. Goodness and mercy are not trailing politely behind him. They are hunting him down, goodness and mercy. The Hebrew is tov and chesed. Tov is plain goodness. Chesed is the loyal covenant love of God. The steady, almost stubborn, refuses to leave kind of love. And David, of all people, knew what it meant to be hunted. As a young man, he was hunted across the wilderness by King Saul, who wanted him dead. Later, as king, he was hunted again, this time by his own son Absalom, who rose against him with an army and drove him out of his own city. Hunted by Philistines, hunted by old grudges, hunted by his own choices and his own conscience. The man who wrote this psalm had spent most of his life being chased, And then in the last verse of his most famous poem, he uses the very word that had been used about him his whole life and aims it at something completely different. It is not enemies that hunt him now. It is goodness. It is loyalty. It is the patient love of God that has decided to chase him down for the rest of his life. And the last line locks the whole psalm together. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Look where the sheep ends up. Not back in the pasture, not curled in a fold. The sheep ends inside the house. The poem began outside. Sheep in a field, then walked through still water, through dark ravines, through the host's threshold. And in this last verse, the speaker simply does not leave. He does not return to the pasture at sunset. He stays inside with the host. The despised shepherd's boy, who was not even called in from the flock when the prophet arrived, now has a permanent room in the only palace that matters. That is what is hidden in the last line of the psalm. The shepherd does not just keep David alive, he brings him all the way home. Now look at what the whole poem has actually done. The shepherd metaphor that the empires of the world used to flatter kings was taken by a king and given upward. And God in the poem took the lowest status worker in Israel and used him to do for David what no Pharaoh or Caesar could. Keep him alive in the valley, set him at a table, anoint him, refill his cup, hunt him with kindness, bring him home. That is what Psalm 23 actually meant, not a soft lullaby for the dying, a king's manifesto. A despised metaphor turned into the truest thing he ever wrote. It is not the verse you only read at the end of someone's life. It is the verse about being chased your whole life by a goodness you did not earn, and being brought in the end into a house you did not build. That is what the Lord is my shepherd really meant. Not a lullaby, a homecoming. Now you have heard the psalm the way it was first heard. Hear it that way every time after this.